world about major historical events, and have we been told the truth?
And hearing about the content of this book has widened and opened my eyes.
For taking the pains and troubles to put to paper his thoughts, which is a legacy.
For me, I look forward to seeing the contents of this. Someone mentioned the fact that it could be a reference book, and I think that could be useful.
I'm here to support the people of Eritrea.
Dear colleagues and representatives from the diplomatic community, members of the media and friends of Eritrea, I wish to extend my sincere greetings. It's a privilege to host you today alongside with Mr. Saleh Abdullah, Chair of the Affairs of the Embassy of State of Eritrea here at the Embassy. Welcome to the premiere book, launch of an African people's quest for freedom and justice, authored by Alemseged Tesfai, an esteemed lawyer and historian. Alemseged Tesfai was born in 1944 in the southern Eritrea town of Ad-Dukhana. He is also recognized as a country premier playwright. His drama, The Other War, was the first Eritrean play ever published and the first to be translated into English. Today, we are gathered here to celebrate the launch of his new book. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, please help me welcoming Alemseged Tesfai to the podium.
Well, this book narrates an African story that Africans know very little about. It's a story about the aspirations of an African people that was taken out of its African context to become an issue confined within internal Ethiopian affairs. For Eritrean nationalists, Ethiopia became the African face of European colonization, like a proxy colonizer for Eritrean nationalists. And that was the basis of the struggle of the Eritrean people for independence. How did this happen? Like most African countries, states, modern African states, Eritrea became an Italian colony in 1890. 1890. When we think that Uganda, Eritrea's colonization was a slow process that started in Aseb in 1860s, and then it took the Italians 30 years to crawl up the highlands and occupy Asmara and establish their Italian colony. When we think that Uganda became such a colony in 1894, Sudan in 1899, Congo in 1908, Nigeria, 1914, I believe, and Kenya in 1920, Eritrea was a senior to all these countries. And I'm not even boasting about that. I'm not boasting about it. I'm just stating the fact that it was a senior to many of these African colonies. But when it came to the decolonization of the African continent, especially the disposal of the former Italian colonies, Eritrea was denied the right that was accorded every other African country as far as their decolonization rights were concerned. Three factors played in this particular drama that later on culminated in the Eritrean independence in 1991. First was the role of the British, and I mean Britain, by the way. The role of the British that the British took. When they ejected the Italians out of Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somaliland in 1941, they came with the open declaration that they were going to be caretaker government, a caretaker administration in each of these countries. But as far as Eritrea was concerned, that declaration was put aside, completely put aside, because they came with their own preconceived strategic plan for the region as a whole, but particularly for Eritrea also. Because at the center of their regional plan was the creation of a united Somalia consisting of the 5 stars in the Somali flag. The 3 Somalilands, the Ogaden from Ethiopia, and the Somali parts of Kenya. And from these 5 units, they had this idea of creating a united Somalia. And in compensation to Ethiopia's loss of the Ogaden, they proposed the partition of Eritrea, the highlands and the coastal regions to go to Ethiopia, and the western and the northern and western regions, basically Islamic areas, to join the Sudan. That became their strategy, their policy, for as long as they lived in Eritrea, as long as they stayed in Eritrea. That was the British plan for Eritrea. They considered Eritrea an odd assortment of different tribes put together by the Italians that did not have the makings of a state. That was their decision. And despite their initial declarations that they would respect the right of Eritreans to decide their own future, and their declaration that they would be only a caretaker government on behalf of the 4 great powers and later on the United Nations, they immediately started to delve into internal Eritrean affairs, and that's how they handled the whole situation for as long as they was there. They very successfully connected Ethiopia's then status as a newly, as a nation, as a state, to 3,000 years of history that went back to the origins of the Aksumite Empire. They convinced a lot of people that this was the case, and that Eritrea had always constituted one part of an integral part of this continuous state of Ethiopia that existed for 3,000 years. Incidentally, in those, and this got the support of the British. It was emboldened by the British attitude towards Eritrea anyway, of this, partition of Eritrea between the Muslim and the Christian parts, and then the ceding of this part of the Christian and the coastal parts of Eritrea to Ethiopia. It was emboldened. Ethiopia was emboldened by this. At the same time, also, Ethiopia had the sympathy of the Western world, because when Mussolini's forces attacked Ethiopia, Emperor Haile Selassie, who went to exile, had appealed to the League of Nations for help and warned the world body that a fascist takeover at the global stage was on the footing, and nobody heeded his warnings. And there was a lot of sympathy for him after World War II, that some compensation should be given to Ethiopia for the suffering that it had suffered under the Italians. There was this sympathy, and it was a well-deserved sympathy, really. Yeah. But it affected the lives of a people who had an equal right also for deciding their own future. Now, the third factor that we need to consider, that this book considers also, is the internal political situation in Eritrea itself. Eritreans got divided into two diametrically opposed political trends. One wanted independence, the independence of Eritrea. This was basically composed of mainly Muslim Eritreans who were afraid, concerned about joining a declared Christian state of Ethiopia. But there was a significant portion of the Christian population also who sided with them. So it was not all a Muslim movement. Now, the Muslim movement itself was based on a previous uprising by serfs, tenants in the feudal structure in northern and western Eritrea. So it has that social base. The other was the Unionists, a section of the Eritrean population, mainly the Christian parts, but also including the upper crust of the Muslim feudal structure, sided with the Unionists, and there was this big dichotomy, this big difference between Eritreans themselves. The Unionist Party, which had the support of the Ethiopians, and which was always benignly supported by the British also, was well organized, well financed, armed. A guerrilla movement that controlled much of the Eritrean hinterland of the countryside, rooted for union with Ethiopia, and they also employed urban terrorist activities within Asmara and the other major urban areas where the independence movement was most visible and was strongest. And as a result, many of the leaders of the independence movement were assassinated, particularly Abdul Qadir Kabire and Kasai Maru and a host of others and some of the Italian and half-caste, we call them half-caste, mixed Italo-Eritreans, as we call them, who rooted for independence were assassinated, several of these. So the independence movement was really at a disadvantage. But paradoxically, both the independent movement, the Eritrean nationalists, and the unionists who rooted for union with Ethiopia, objected very strenuously, very strongly to the British plan of partition. The unionists wanted a united Eritrea to join Ethiopia so they would have a bargaining power. They were not just going into Ethiopia and to become another province, another Ilubabur or Shawa or Gondar or whatever. They wanted to go to Ethiopia with a bargaining power to occupy certain positions in the Ethiopian government, to become important Ethiopians, not a bunch of Eritreans who just joined and then become just one of the crowds in Ethiopia who were oppressed, they knew were oppressed by the imperial regime. And the independence movement also wanted a united Eritrea, undivided in any way, unpartitioned, to become an independent state. Now this particular element was to become the uniting factor of both these two divergent groups. Because when the question of the settlement of the issue of the former Italian colonies came to the four great powers and to the General Assembly of the United Nations, both these bodies could not solve the problem. They could not solve the problem. And in 1948, I think it was, the British and the Italians came to an agreement in what is known as the Bevins-Forza Agreement that decided to divide Eritrea, to partition Eritrea into the British plan. And the United Nations also took this to heart. The United States also supported it, and Ethiopia supported the idea of a partitioned Eritrea. The excuse they gave at the time was that first they would partition Eritrea and then ask for the other half to come, for the other half to and then to work for bringing the other part to the fold. But this worked against the Ethiopians, especially amongst the Unionists, especially amongst the Unionist youth, who were the most vociferous, the strongest supporters of union with Ethiopia. Because they started to realize that Ethiopia, or to suspect that Ethiopia was actually not working to liberate Eritreans from foreign domination and to make them equal Ethiopians, but that Ethiopia was really at heart seeking access to the sea, not the people, but the sea. So after this Bevins-Forza agreement failed, a lot of the Unionists defected from the Unionist camp to go to the independence movement. And the independence movement became an extremely strong body. In fact, some of the British documentations did claim that about 75%, after the Bevins-Forza agreement failed, about 75% of the people of Eritrea wanted independence. Well, the United States came in, and the United States also had a similar strategic interest in the area, and they wanted Ethiopia to become their people, a strong Ethiopian nation on the Red Sea coastline. And so they devised this very strange arrangement, federal arrangement, that was never seen before and that has never been seen since. They convinced the United Nations, or at least imposed this idea on the United Nations, that Eritrea would become an autonomous region federated to Ethiopia under the sovereignty of the Ethiopian crown. So they gave it certain internal rights, but the basic rights of foreign affairs, finance, and so on and so forth was to be taken by the Ethiopian government. No federal government was established at the Ethiopian level. At the Ethiopian government, the state of Ethiopia, the empire of Ethiopia would be at the same time the federal government, and Eritrea would be an autonomous region within that federal structure. It was a very odd, a real cession of property, of territory that bore the name of federation. the Eritreans objected to this, very seriously objected to it. But, I mean, they had no voice. And the interest of peace and security, they accepted it in the hope that even that particular arrangement would work. Now the United Nations was responsible for the ultimate implementation of this structure, of this strange structure, and which they did, put it in place, and left. The United Nations left, the British left, the Americans left. No guarantees of this particular setup to the Eritreans. And then eager Ethiopia, that was given all the chance to annex Eritrea at any time. I think they waited for about 10 years. 10 years later, Ethiopia annexed Eritrea. Now, a lot of the literature that exists in the Horn of Africa regarding Eritrea declares, or at least claims, that the Eritrean struggle for independence, the armed struggle for independence, began because Ethiopia abrogated that federal arrangement. That's a misconception. That's not true. The Eritrean struggle for independence started before the implementation of the federation itself. It was an objection to the federation that started the Eritrean struggle for independence, not the abrogation of the federation. This is a misconception that Ethiopians and Eritreans need to understand each other about. We have been fighting too many wars. We have been in conflict too much with our Ethiopian brothers about this issue. Let me end by reading to you what the leader of the independence movement, Ibrahim Sultan Ali, said at the United Nations, in the United Nations. On the morning of, I think it was November 28th, or I could be, I don't know, it's here somewhere. When he was called before the political committee to say a few words about the impending decision by the General Assembly to decide on the issue of federation. So here's what he said. This was before the political committee. And the General Assembly was ready to give its final decision sometime in those following days. We would like to ask the members of this commission, how many of them have, in the past, had their countries subjected to colonialism and only earned their independence after shedding the precious blood of their sons and sacrificing the flowers of their youth? Why are we, therefore, being deprived of the independence which is the natural right of all nations of the world? Is it because of the existence and presence here of a little group which calls for unity with a foreign country? Our country is the neighbor of a large country which wants to annex us and annex us to it in spite of the wishes of our people. We have an administration governing our country which wants to divide our country and to annex part of it, at least to Ethiopia. Both parties object to our idea of independence. This is how this group mushroomed, and it is, in fact, a minority. He was talking about the unionists here. I asked the members of this committee, why is European colonialism being fought and opposed? Is it in order to replace it by an African form of colonialism? Ethiopia asked for Somaliland to be annexed to it. Ethiopia had asked, by the way, I forgot that Ethiopia had asked previously for both countries to be annexed to it. Yeah. To be annexed to it. And we are glad to see that Somaliland has had its right of independence recognized. Why, therefore, are we being deprived of this natural right that has been given to Libya and Somaliland? The members of this committee are responsible for what may take place in this part of East Africa. Note this. The members of this committee are responsible for what may take place in this part of East Africa, in the way of skirmishes and uprisings, in case a mistaken decision is made which will force us to resist it in order to earn and maintain our independence and preserve our being. Up to now, we have suffered the difficulties and tolerated hardships only to maintain peace and order in our country, and in the hope that we shall get from the Commission justice and an unbiased attitude towards our natural rights. That very afternoon, I don't know why they called Ibrahim Sultan to speak, because a lot of the members of the committee of the General Assembly, many of the Arabs, many of the Latin Americans had been wondering why Eritreans were not being asked what they wanted. Because throughout the process of decolonization of these Italian colonies, Eritrea was never called to speak. Eritreans were never called to speak about their own preferences. They were always denied access to the four great powers and so on and so forth. What they did was the four great powers had sent a commission of inquiry, and the United Nations also sent a commission of inquiry. But the representatives of those political parties were generally denied access. And whenever they came, they were given a few minutes, 10 minutes or 15 minutes of presentation in ad hoc committees and so on, and never really in the General Assembly. Eritrea was always represented by the very able, seasoned diplomat, Aklilu Habtold, whom for reasons I don't understand, the Derg killed, because he was the single-handed man who brought Eritrea to the Ethiopian fold, a very, very important person in that sense. He was the one who represented the Eritrean interests. So that morning, they called Ibrahim Sultan, he gave this speech, and the political committee met at about 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon and decided to federate Eritrea with Ethiopia. They recommended that decision to the General Assembly, and in the General Assembly, there was this huge discussion of the Russians, the Algerians, or I mean, what have it, not the Algerians, I mean the Syrians and so on, were rooting for Eritrean independence, or at least arguing that Eritreans were not being represented, when Akil Habtold stood up in the General Assembly and promised, in the spirit of peace and compromise, to respect Eritrea's rights under Ethiopia. Everybody applauded, voted. Eritrea became an autonomous unit federated to Ethiopia under the sovereignty of the Ethiopian crown. And that started the struggle for independence, first peaceful. When the peaceful struggle for independence was crushed, then in 1958, a movement called the Eritrean Liberation Movement, the ELM, or the Haraka movement, started, a clandestine organization that worked both in Ethiopia and Eritrea. They stalled on the initiation of an armed struggle. Then the ELF was formed in 1960, And it openly declared an armed struggle, which started in September 1961. When that happened and activities started, the Ethiopians rushed to annex Eritrea in 1962, 1 year after the start of the armed struggle. So the notion that Eritrea struggle for independence started when Ethiopia abrogated the federation should be dispelled. So this book now continues on to in detail to go into the details of what happened throughout this period, which is very, very crucial period before the start of the Eritrean struggle for independence, which ultimately culminated in Eritrea becoming an independent state.
Thank you, Alemseged. Thank you, everyone.
My name is Janet Lawrence. I'm a filmmaker. I made my very first film for Channel 4 in 1986. I've also worked in the US. I worked on a series on the history of the civil rights movement that was on BBC Two for 14 weeks, and the series was nominated for an Oscar. It's really, really important that I'm here to support the people of Eritrea, and that I'm really, really looking forward to reading the book, which will give me a better insight on the history of Eritrea.
My name's Paul G. Andrews. I'm a film producer and award-winning screenwriter. I was very happy to attend because what the book discusses is the history of Eritrea, Ethiopia, going right back. I know they used the period 40 to 52, although people were asking questions. And it's always interesting to see when a book stimulates interest about history. And it's one thing recently with things that are being said in the world about major historical events, and have we been told the truth?
I'm also a radio show presenter for a Pan-African radio station that's been going for 41 years. And our primary objective is about inspiring and advocating the minds of our people and inspiring our people to take action to do for self. First and foremost, that's our primary objective. For me, the reason why I felt today's work, well, coming here and hearing about the content of this book has widened and opened my eyes to a history I didn't know about. And I think the road to liberation is a constant awakening. It's a process of knowing and discovering thyself. And what I feel was so beautiful about the book is that its author is the actual researcher. He's speaking about his history.
My name is Chief Uzo Owune. I was ambassador of Comoros Republic to United Nations International Maritime Organization here in London. Today's event is a good one. That is always a good thing to bring Africans together, to talk to each other, have a conversation. And it happened that we have an eminent African who has taken the troubles to document the struggles and challenges of his own country from their own lens, and not somebody giving them a perspective that how they perceive Eritrea. But he gave account of Eritrea from the point of view of an insider who participated and was part of the struggles and liberation movement. And it's most important that people like him needs to be appreciated and celebrated for taking the pains and troubles to put to paper his thoughts, which, I mean, is a legacy that for generations to come, they will read and understand the path, the difficulties that the independence that they're having in Eritrea today, the path that they got through before they attained that independence.
I, for one, it was very educational for me. That was the question I had that I didn't ask, and maybe I'll use it to answer your question now. And it was what it must have felt like to have had to become independent twice. It was almost like a double independence journey for the Eritreans. First from the colonialists, and of course then from the other neighboring bigger countries, without particularly naming any particular country. And that was a thought that was going through my mind. But I think I had enough of an answer from all that was said. But it did go through my mind that what must that have felt like, And also because, as I said, it wasn't to you, but, the history of the Second World War is one of my areas of general interest. And I remember, the whole journey of Mussolini invading Abyssinia at the time, and it was good to understand that Abyssinia was covering both Eritrea and Ethiopia as a region, and so the context where both peoples were seen as one, yet they were not, and for me that was an interesting journey to understand. Yeah.